50,000. That's not the number of soldiers in a division. That's not the number of bombs dropped on a city. That's the number of M4 Sherman tanks America built during World War II. 50,000 machines, rolling off assembly lines in Detroit, in Lima, in San Jose, shipped to every theater of the war, driven by men from Iowa and Georgia and Brooklyn and Glasgow. And almost every single one of them could be killed by a single German tank they had no business fighting. The Sherman is the most controversial tank in history. Heroes called it a lifesaver. Survivors called it a death trap. Germans called it the Tommy Cooker, because it burned so reliably when hit that British crews nicknamed it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter with the famous slogan, "Lights first time, every time." So which is it? The machine that won the war, or the machine that got men killed winning it? The answer is both, and the full story is more complicated, more human, and more important than either side wants to admit. Stay with me. To understand the Sherman, you have to understand America in 1940. Not the America of 1944, with its massive war industry and its millions of soldiers in uniform. The America of 1940, a country that had spent 20 years trying to forget the last war, that had an army smaller than Portugal's, that had exactly 0 battle-tested tanks in production. When France fell in 6 weeks in May and June of 1940, the shock in Washington was genuine. The German blitzkrieg hadn't just defeated an army. It had demonstrated a completely new way of fighting. Fast, armored, coordinated, brutal. And America looked at its own military and understood. It had almost nothing capable of responding to this. The M3 Lee was rushed into production as an emergency measure. Awkward, high-sided, with its main gun mounted in the hull rather than a rotating turret. It was a stopgap, and everyone knew it. What America needed was a proper medium tank. Fast to build, easy to maintain, reliable enough to survive the logistics of a global war, and armed well enough to fight the tanks Germany was currently fielding. In 1941, when the Sherman was being designed, the most common German tank was the Panzer III and Panzer IV. Against those, a 75mm gun and 50mm of frontal armor was genuinely competitive. The Sherman was designed for the enemy that existed. The problem was that by the time it reached the battlefield in numbers, that enemy had changed. The men who designed and built the Sherman were not fools. They were engineers working under enormous time pressure, with imperfect information, making choices that seemed reasonable at the time. The Continental R975 radial aircraft engine that powered early Shermans was chosen partly because it was already in production and available immediately. It was reliable. It was powerful enough. The fact that it ran on high-octane aviation fuel that vaporized catastrophically when ignited was a problem, but one the designers believed could be managed with proper ammunition stowage and crew training. The armor layout was a compromise. The Sherman's hull was tall, taller than it needed to be, partly because of the radial engine's dimensions. That height made it a bigger target. The armor was sloped on the hull front, which was good, but the turret was relatively boxy, and the overall protection was calculated against the threats of 1941, not 1943. The suspension, the vertical volute spring system on most variants, was workable but not exceptional. It gave a rough ride cross-country. Crews learned to deal with it. What the designers got right was everything else. The gun was accurate and its ammunition was excellent. The turret was spacious by the standards of the era. Crews had room to work. The mechanical reliability was outstanding. Shermans broke down far less often than Panthers or Tigers, which required constant maintenance and still managed to break their tracks, their final drives, their engines with alarming regularity. A Sherman that wasn't being shot at was almost certainly moving. A Panther that wasn't being shot at might still be sitting at the side of the road with a burned-out transmission. And the production numbers mattered more than most people realize. You cannot win a world war with a tank. You can only build 300 of per month. The Sherman could be built by the thousands. Every factory that understood mass production could make them. That wasn't a failure of imagination. It was a deliberate and largely correct strategic choice. Let's talk about what the Sherman actually was, in its various forms, because the Sherman was not one tank. It was a family. The M4 and M4A1 were the earliest and most common variants. The M4 used a welded hull. The M4A1 had a distinctive cast hull. Both used the 75mm M3 gun in early production, later upgraded to the 76mm M1 in the M4A176 and subsequent variants. Weight ranged from around 30 tons in early models to 35 tons in later, more heavily armoured versions. The British took the Sherman and added their own 17-pounder anti-tank gun, one of the best guns of the war, creating the Firefly. The Firefly could kill a Tiger at ranges the standard Sherman gun couldn't manage. The Germans specifically targeted Fireflies first in any engagement because they were the actual threat, which, in a brutal way, was a compliment. The M4A3E8, the Easy 8, with its horizontal volute spring suspension and 76mm gun, was arguably the best all-around Sherman variant. Smoother ride, better gun, improved armor on later versions. The crews who drove Easy 8s in 1945 and Korea had a significantly different machine than the ones who landed in North Africa in 1942. The engine variety tells you something about how pragmatic the Sherman program was. Different factories used different engines: Chrysler Multibank, Ford GAAV8, GM Diesel, the original Continental Radial. The Ford GAAV8 in the M4A3 was probably the best of them, reliable, powerful, and it ran on the same 80-octane gasoline as most military vehicles rather than aviation fuel. Top speed on a road was around 47 kilometers per hour, depending on the variant. Good for a medium tank. The range was respectable, the logistics tail was manageable. These things matter in a real war in a way that armor thickness tables don't fully capture. The Sherman's combat record spans every theater of the war and both sides of history's judgment. In North Africa, the Sherman's debut in October 1942 at El Alamein was a success. Against the Panzer III and Panzer IV variants Germany was fielding at the time, the Sherman was competitive or superior. British and American crews were confident in their machines. The gun worked. The reliability was excellent compared to what they'd been driving before. Then came Tunisia, then Italy, and the Panzer IV long-barreled variants and the first encounters with the Panther started changing the equation. The 75mm gun struggled against the Panther's frontal armor at normal combat ranges. The Sherman's own frontal armor was vulnerable to German 75 and 88mm guns from distances that made the engagement deeply uncomfortable. The crews adapted. They always do. They learned to angle their hulls to increase effective armor thickness. They learned that close terrain, hedgerows, city streets, hills, reduced the range advantages of German guns. They learned to work in groups, to use smoke, to call artillery. They became very good at a game with rules that were stacked against them, and they kept winning battles despite it. Normandy was brutal. The bocage country of northern France was a nightmare for any armor, and the Sherman's height made it worse. But the Allied advance continued. The German army retreated. The war moved toward Germany. In the Pacific, the Sherman faced Japanese tanks that were genuinely outclassed by it in every category. Against the Type 97 Chiha and its contemporaries, the 75mm gun was overkill. The Sherman was king in the Pacific in a way it never quite managed in Europe. Korea brought the Sherman back for another war, and here it performed excellently against North Korean T-34/85s in the early battles. The 76mm gun variants could handle the T-34 effectively. The Pershing and later Patton tanks were better, but the Sherman crews in Korea weren't fighting in a machine that embarrassed them. The comparison with its enemies is where the Sherman's reputation suffers most, and where context matters most. Sherman 75mm versus Panther. The Panther wins in a straight frontal engagement at medium range, almost every time. The Panther's frontal armor shrugs off the 75mm. The Sherman's frontal armor is vulnerable to the Panther's long 75mm gun from 800 meters and beyond. This is bad. This is the fact that Sherman critics cite correctly. Sherman 76mm versus Panther, much closer. The 76mm can penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at closer ranges, and the Panther's gun advantage shrinks considerably. Not equal, but not the massacre the earlier matchup was. Sherman Firefly versus Tiger, the Firefly wins. The 17-pounder goes through the Tiger's armor. The Tiger can still kill the Firefly, but the Firefly is not helpless, and the Tiger's mechanical unreliability means it may not even make it to the fight. Sherman versus T-34/85, roughly equal. The T-34/85's gun can kill the Sherman. The Sherman's gun can kill the T-34/85. Both machines are in the same general weight class with similar protection. The Sherman's mechanical reliability is arguably better. The T-34's lower profile is a genuine advantage. Call it a draw. What the comparisons never capture is the ratio. In 1944, every Panther and every Tiger that was knocked out, broke down, ran out of fuel, or was captured represented an irreplaceable loss for Germany. Every Sherman that was destroyed was replaced by 3 more coming off the assembly line. The arithmetic of industrial warfare is merciless and simple. The side that can sustain losses and keep fighting eventually wins. What is the Sherman's legacy? It is the tank that won World War II, not by being the best tank on the battlefield, but by being good enough in sufficient numbers, reliable enough to keep moving, and producible enough to replace every loss and still have more. It is also the tank whose limitations got men killed who deserved better. The crews who burned in their machines in Normandy because their armor couldn't stop what was being fired at them. Their sacrifice is real, and the doctrine that sent them into those situations with those machines deserves its share of criticism. Both things are true. The Sherman was a tool of industrial warfare used in a strategy of industrial warfare, and that strategy worked. But tools have human beings inside them, and the men inside the Sherman paid the price for the choices made far above their pay grade. The Sherman served in armies around the world for decades after 1945. Israel used modified Shermans in 1973, nearly 30 years after the tank's introduction, and they performed well. That's not a bad run for a machine built as a wartime emergency. 50,000 tanks, most of them gone now, scrapped, melted down, a few preserved in museums. But the men who drove them are part of that number too, and they deserve to be remembered as something more than a statistic in an argument about armor thickness. So here's the question for the comments. Was the Sherman a strategic success and a tactical failure, or is that too simple an answer? And given everything you now know, would you rather have been a Sherman crew member or a Panther crew member in the summer of 1944? Think about that one carefully before you answer. Like if you enjoyed this, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.